Hi, my name is Mike Flynn. I'm a longtime Rotary 4 member and board member and longtime publisher of Puget Sound Business Journal, president, publisher. It's my pleasure today to be interviewing Daniel J. Evans, former 3-term governor, 1-term senator, though he didn't try for another term, so we don't really know what would have happened, and viewed by many as the most imposing political figure in the history of the state. Since I first interviewed the governor in 1966, when I was a young UPI reporter in Olympia, and he was 42, not quite 2 years into his governorship, and there's a picture over on the table, if you haven't seen it, that I decided to bring along. We've done dozens of these, including a previous one in 2008 for Seattle 4. So we know pretty much where each other's going to go on these Q&As. Before we begin, I need to introduce Dan's wife, Nancy. Raise your hand, Nancy, who has been his key supporter and strategist for their 62 years of marriage before he was governor. So let's start the interview. So the 1964 election in which Lyndon Johnson destroyed Barry Goldwater to win the presidential race was virtually a Democratic sweep nationally. But interestingly, in this state, you defeated a governor seeking his 3rd term, popular Democratic governor, and at the Secretary of State level, City Council member Lud Kramer defeated the longtime Secretary of State incumbent Democrat. How did that happen?
Well, I don't know, but I started to run for governor about a year and a half before the election, and about 14 months before the election, it turned into a full-time campaign. So I spent that long really getting to know the state, getting to know the voters, but also having them get to know me, because I started with virtually no name familiarity. They took a poll a year and a half before the election of 6 potential Republican candidates for governor. I ran 6 out of 6. The only positive thing in the poll was that only 2% of the people knew really who I was, but I had 5% of the vote. So that was a positive, I guess.
But that was also true of Lud Kramer. So that was 2 Republicans. Yep. Upset the national trend. So there must have been something in this state that people were open to take a look at 2 Republicans.
Well, I probably part of it was wanting to have somebody new, because Governor Rossellini was running for a 3rd term. Vic Myers, who ran against Lud Kramer, had been Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor for many years before that. And they figured it was time for somebody new.
Interestingly, given the similar political situation today, when you came into office, the Republicans were in a state of division. The conservatives gathered under the banner of the John Birch Society, and then they were conventional. Well, the conservatives probably didn't think of themselves as not conventional, but then there were the other side, the more moderate Republicans. Then the King County Republicans wanted to get rid of you for your whole term in office, I think. Mm-hmm. Can you recall those divisions and that divisive environment, and frame again the issues dividing the Republicans then, and how different is that from now?
I suspect that a lot of people think that today is virtually unheard of differences and divisions, but they sound pretty familiar. We had deep divisions in those days. The group, we tend to put people into groups, but they're much more different among themselves than we think. But in the Goldwater days, some of the supporters of Goldwater were pretty different from most most voters, and we had the governor running all the time, trying to put me in the same barrel as Goldwater. And we were spending most of the time trying to assert independence from anybody else, and that I was running on what ideas I had.
As you were preparing for a run for your second term in 1968, you were tapped to be the keynoter at the Republican National Convention. The nomination seemed to be in a battle there, even though Nixon won fairly easily. It seemed like Nelson Rockefeller might have an opportunity, and I know there were even some conservatives who, recalling at that point, that hoped Ronald Reagan might make a run for it. How did it happen that you were tapped to be the keynoter? And I'd like you to share your thoughts on the nomination fight that occurred and how you came out for Rockefeller at a time when some people were saying Nixon might choose you as his vice president.
Well, I think a choice as vice president would have been really pretty unusual.
Well, you picked the governor.
I had served one term as, in fact, in '68, I had just served one term, was running for re-election, but
You got tapped to be the keynoter.
But I was tapped as the keynoter. Yeah, that's right.
Were you surprised by that?
No, I had wanted to do it, and had some supporters that were really involved with the National Republican Committee, so we had some inside help. But ultimately, they made the choice. Interestingly enough, I wasn't sure what kind of direction or what kind of thing would happen with the Republican National Committee. I never heard a word. When I was chosen as keynoter, no one ever called and suggested that you better do this or you better do that. So I was totally on my own.
Cool, but then in the discussion after the beginning of the convention, there was some conversation about you being governor. I mean, to being the vice president.
Well, I wasn't in on any of those conversations, so I could only notice from the outside. Probably was closer or more serious in 1976 when it was up to Gerald Ford after he was nominated to make a choice.
You mean there was some thought of you then?
More so in 1976 than in 1968, yes.
So if you really didn't think about being the vice president with Nixon, then it probably didn't occur to you to think how close you might have come to being president, since his vice president did become.
No, well, and you always think, sometimes you always think back and probably think that you would have done a lot of great things that you might not have done at the time, but I always thought that if I had been chosen as vice president, I think that I would have had some different views, hopefully the chance to express them to the president, and maybe get him to not be quite so
Might have been different
off base.
president. I have a fun question that I want to ask you, and you're kind enough to let me deal with that. We discussed in the last time we did an interview here that you owe your career to the Democrats, but I didn't realize you'd been running before the '61 conference in the woods.
Yeah.
Oh, you had, okay. So maybe that's how it came up. Anyway, in this state, interestingly, power, public versus private power, has always been a big Democratic issue, because what Democrat wouldn't be for public power? Well, if you're a Spokane Democrat and your power company is Avista now, used to be Washington Water Power, then that's your sacred company in your town. They do everything for you, and nobody better screw around with them. And so in '61, apparently, there was some power issue divided the Democrats. And the Democrats in the legislative house had 4-vote majority, and there were 5 Democrats in Spokane. And somehow, can you take the story and how it came about that you met with them to determine you're going to get together?
Well, the biggest issue that was driving Republicans in the legislature in those days was redistricting. We were at the front edge of the requirements to redistrict. We hadn't done it in this state for years successfully. And it was to the point where some districts had 8 times as many voters as other legislative districts. But we were at a point where they had to do it. The Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the governorship, and we were afraid that we would get gerrymandered out of power for the next 10 years. So, but it was a different set of issues that were driving the Democratic rebels. They did not like John O'Brien as Speaker because he was a very good speaker, but he was tough, and they didn't like some of the things that he was pushing. So they finally got to the point where they said to themselves, you know, the Speaker doesn't have lifetime assurance of that position, and they did get in touch with us and said, would you be interested in a coalition?
Now tell the story about the cabin in the woods.
We had a traditional dinner get-together of our Republican office holders, both new and continuing, the night before the session started. And by that time, we had been the leadership had been in conversations with Big Daddy Day and some of the Democrats. And we talked with them at some time. We had a lot of people in our own caucus that don't even think about it. You can't get together with the Democrats. It's too dangerous. But we finally got them to recognize that we were facing redistricting, and we had to do anything we could to avoid getting redistricted right out of power for a long, long time. And that led to the final meeting, which did occur on the outskirts of Olympia. And
When the Democrats told you to hide in the trees until the light went on in the cabin, right, if I remember.
they told us where to go, and we went out to Cooper Point and then down the side road into a deep forest. And we got to a small clearing with a cabin in it. And I stopped the car, turned off the lights, and it was really dark. But we could see a light in the window. They didn't have any lights on, but they had a fire in the fireplace. So the light was flickering in the window. We finally got out, went up, knocked on the door. And it was pretty impressive. When the door opened, there was Big Daddy. He's about 6'4" and weighed 300 pounds. And he was the leader of the rebels. And we went in, and it was pretty interesting. Slade was with us, and he started off and he said, well, now if we're going to have a coalition, Evans ought to be Speaker because we've got 48 votes. And they said, that'll never happen. We'll never
Big Daddy said, if it ain't me, get back in the woods. You told me once.
Practically. And we were just using this as a trial to see what would happen, but figured that it was smarter for us to not have the speakership anyhow. Most everybody was saying, this coalition, if it happens, will never last the whole session, and it'll collapse, and then the Democrats will take over. But we got together, and at the end of that meeting, we had decided that we would try for a coalition, but it was under my control that on the first ballot, that 6 of the Democrats who were part of this coalition would vote for Day. The rest would vote for John O'Brien, who was the regular Democrats candidate. The rest would vote for me, so nobody would have a majority. They'd go to a second ballot. The same thing happened. The rebels gained 1 vote from 6 to 7. And at the beginning of the third ballot, I leaned forward to Dr. Adams and said, Doc, you're first on the roll call vote. Next time it's Day. And so the third ballot was taken, and the first name on the ballot was Dr. Adams. And How do you vote? Day. Boy, I saw more heads swivel around and consternation and conversation. And as the time went on, every Republican was voting for day. And John O'Brien knew that things were in deep trouble. And one thing I remember most about that vote was that halfway through, John O'Brien came across the aisle and stood in front of me. And I was seated, and he stood in front of me with his arms outstretched and said, isn't there something we can do? Can halt this and work something out? And I was probably not as respectful as I should have been. At the speaker, I just said, John, school's out. And the ballot went on, and Day was elected. And then the regular Democrats got into a real opposition. They wouldn't let anything go through. And we were just trying to organize and get the committees set and that sort of thing. At the first Saturday, after we had been held up for a week, we pulled the same trick that O'Brien had pulled on us 2 years earlier. And that is, when you wanted something, you posed the question you wanted, then started the roll call. And we did. Slade got up and said, all of the amendments the Democrats have on the desk are frivolous and unnecessary, and I move that they all be laid on the table and that we adopt the program as the speaker has suggested. And the speaker said, the issues in front of us, all those in favor. And by that time, the regular Democrats were screaming, roll call, roll call. And he just looked at them. All in favor say aye, all opposed say no. And he said the motion is carried and we're adjourned. And that broke the...
I've always thought that's one of the coolest stories in politics in this state that nobody really knew about.
Well, that's right. Because it was necessary in order to get things going. We'd elected him speaker, but he couldn't do anything until we organized the House of Representatives. And finally, when we did, we took a tape recording of that, and we used to take it into the caucus. And later on in the session, when things got going on other issues and they were tough and we were tired, we'd have a caucus, and just before the end of the caucus, I'd have them play what became known as the 57 seconds, which was the length of time it took for him to call the roll and to grab control. And that jazzed us up to go out and fight again.
So I assume that has a piece of what I'm now going to ask you. The constant question you have to get is, how's your book coming?
Done.
So can you explain that? So it's now in the hands of the editor.
Well, not quite. It's still in my hands, but all I'm doing is going through the final printing. It's printed as it will appear in the book, and I'm about a quarter of the way through. So,
what's the name? I mean, what's the title going to be?
That is yet to come.
There must be a chapter in there, though, on Art Fletcher and your virtually unknown role in trying to prepare for the election of what would have been the first Black governor since Reconstruction in this state. It's a story I've never been able to understand. It not being universal, because the story of how 3 Republican elected officials would create a strategy to try to elect a Black man as governor, it couldn't conceivably happen today.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. At that time, I was, at the time all of this started, I was running for re-election in 1968. And during a year or two earlier than that, in getting around the state and working on issues, I ran across Art Fletcher, who was then running a
self-help
organization the black community of the Tri-Cities area in Eastern Washington. And it was one of those things where, I went to interview him because I just wanted to find out what was going on. And that one interview was spectacular. He was so good, and he wasn't asking for a whole lot of money. His whole deal was a self-help organization. We've got to figure out how we can do for ourselves rather than just seeking help from the outside.
And I think Neil, as your press secretary, mentioned that conversation, so I did a column on him.
Yeah.
First time the media had a chance to do a column on him because he's over in the Tri-Cities. So
Yeah.
he was a very
Well,
cool guy.
we finally we had started an organization called Action for Washington, and the whole idea was to get young people involved politically. And we started Action for Washington without calling it a Republican organization, although it was led by the young people involved in our administration. But we got them involved, and then said, 68 election is coming up. You should really be involved as young people. Get organized and get involved. Choose your candidates. And they did. The young people that we'd really gotten them enthusiastic. Now they started talking to various candidates, and they finally settled. I don't know how they could have gone anywhere else, because once you had an interview with Art Fletcher, he would capture you, and he captured them, and they came back and said, we want to support Art Fletcher. And we created what was called the Action Team, which was my running for re-election as governor. We had the re-election, of course, of Lud Kramer as Secretary of State, Slade Gorton running for Attorney General, and Art Fletcher for Lieutenant Governor.
It was amazing photos of the campaign photos of
Oh gosh, yeah.
3 guys and the black guy running for lieutenant governor.
He was about 4 inches taller than anybody else. And he ran a first-rate campaign in the primary, won the primary fairly handily, and got into the final. And on election night, I thought we might very well have scored 4 for 4, because Slade was leading by a very, very small margin. Lud and I had very strong margins for re-election, and Art Fletcher was ahead. And he was ahead most all of the evening of election until later on. And then by a few votes.
And he was running against a long time,
Oh,
like John Sherburne.
Yeah, Johnny Sherburne had been lieutenant governor for quite a while and was running for re-election. And here this upstart was running ahead of him. And then it turned, and unfortunately by about 30,000 votes out of 800,000, he prevailed. And I think that's too bad, because Art Fletcher would have been sensational as a lieutenant governor.
Yeah, potential governor.
Well, and then I thought when I stepped down as governor, he would have been in a great position to run, and I think he would have won
Well, that's an amazing strategy in '68 for 3 Republicans to plot that, not publicly, just to themselves. Instead, he became Nixon's because of your influence in the administration. He became part of the Labor Department and was the creator of affirmative action.
Yes.
So maybe it was well that he lost.
He played an important role nationally, and maybe that was broader than it could have been for him to stay in the state of Washington.
Can you look out to 2024 and offer some thoughts on what the election might hold, if you're okay to get into that political topic?
Sure, I can say anything I want now. I haven't.
Right.
But I don't quite know what to say, because it's too early for 2024 to be very clear. I think that Joe Biden may run for re-election, depending on how things go in the next 3 years. But on the Republican side, Trump is still standing astride the Republican Party, but I do not think he will end up being the candidate in 2024. I think as we get closer, there will be more and more really good Republicans who step forward and want to run. And Trump was the brand new candidate 4 years ago. He won't be anymore. I think, frankly, no matter what kind of health he's in, he would not. He'd be too old to be a respectable president, I think. Says me, who's 95. So, but I know when too old is too old.
Is there anything in the book that's coming out that you were pleased particularly about writing and remembering?
Oh boy. I started out enthusiastically many years ago, actually writing without any electronics, and got well into it, but other things were going on, and so time went on also. And here it is many years later, but maybe at an appropriate time. And it was fun to get into it, but I think I buy into Winston Churchill's statement about writing a book, where he said you start out enthusiastically, and then it turns into a job to be done, and pretty soon it's a burden, and then it's an albatross around your neck, and with that you finish it and ship it off to the publishers. So I guess I'm about at the albatross stage right now.
So there's still waiting to do and thought process. Hey, I need to ask you, the executive orders, I need to touch base with your thoughts on that. Both in the White House and from the governor's office in this state have become a frequent way to bypass legislative process and legislative deliberations. Can you share your thoughts on what do you think of the process of the executive orders?
Well, executive orders are fine, but they were designed to be and should be limited in scope and time. The governor has worked under an executive order now for a couple of years without going to the legislature. I think that's wrong. I think that it's way too long. I think that the governor is head of the executive branch, but when you have an executive order running things for that long, that to me is equivalent to legislation, and you should go to the legislature to get approval for its continuity. He hasn't, he's gotten away with it, but I don't think that that's appropriate.
Is there anything when you look back you wished you'd accomplished during your political life? Maybe the income tax that you sought to have?
When I think of things that I was pushing hard that didn't happen, sure, tax reform would have been the biggest by far. Interestingly enough, tax reform was one of my biggest legislative successes. When tax reform got on the ballot or on the legislative agenda, it passed the House, which was majority Republican in that time. It passed the House 84-11, which is about as good as you can get. Bipartisan support, big time, and it passed the Senate by more than 2-1, and went to the ballot and got defeated by the electorate 2.5-1. So
The public prevailed.
Public prevailed, and we tried it one more time, and that time it was 3.5-1. So I left it for the next generation to see what they could do, which so far has been nothing. But when I look back, because people always have talked to me and said, well, you were for the income tax. And I said, no, I was for tax reform, of which a limited income tax was a piece. But tax reform meant the elimination and a cutback on many other taxes. It balanced the tax system better. But I've actually opposed some of the more recent attempts for an income tax, which was just to put it on top of all the other taxes we have. And I didn't think that was appropriate.
It's really been cool, Dan, to have you here and share your thoughts, reflections, and welcome to the Rotary session that we've had. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well, my privilege, and I look back. There's a lot more looking back to than looking forward to in terms of time, I suppose. But when I look back on the opportunities I've had, most of them given by the voters of this state, I can just say I'm grateful, because it has been a terrific opportunity to be both governor and senator from this state. And I think we made some real progress, and good things happened. We left a lot more for the next people to work on, which is okay.
Well, thanks for all you've done.
Thank you.